Hello, everybody. I want to thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Paul Wagner. I'm the coordinator for activities here at the UAVs for Payload Delivery Working Group. If this is your first event with us, welcome. We're glad to have you. And I will be sharing a recording of this presentation later after we finish. So if you are not currently part of our working group, you can just send me a private message through the group chat here on Zoom. Just send me your email, and I can make sure that you get a copy of the recording. And again, if you are new to the UAVs for Payload Delivery Working Group, we do schedule webinars and roundtable discussions like this on a semi-regular basis. So if you would like to join the working group at the end of this presentation of this webinar, I'll share contact information if you want to join. But yeah, let's get started. Let's make sure that you stay muted just to minimize the background noise. This webinar is sharing a new guide that was produced by Scott Dubin. He's works for the Global Health Supply Chain Management program. It's funded by USAID, supported by Chemonics. We're really excited about this. It was actually released just last month, so it is new. So thank you, Scott, for being willing to share. I'll just give it to you. If any of you participants have any questions, please don't hesitate. Just type your question in the chat box. Please add your name and who you're with, just so we know who's asking the question. And I'll just kind of interrupt Scott so he can answer it while he's on that topic. And then, of course, at the end, we'll also open this up for questions as well. So thank you all, and thank you, Scott. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And hello, everyone. I appreciate you joining us. It's a great opportunity to communicate with others who are both utilizing UAVs or thinking about it or just interested in the topic. And we're very excited to share our procurement guide with everyone. And I believe that was part of the invitation. And we'll also let you know where you can download the guide itself. First, I just want to say thanks to Paul and the UAV for Payload Delivery Working Group for hosting us. It's a great opportunity for us to share with the community. And like Paul said, really, I'd like you to feel free to ask questions as we move forward. So it's more of a conversation. And again, we can get to questions at the end as well. So let me just get started here. Okay, so a quick introduction. Again, myself, I'm Scott Dubin. I'm the team lead here on the GHSC PSM project, the team lead for warehousing and distribution. I'm also the UAV project lead. On the UAV team, we also have Ashley Grieve and Bailey Ebby. And so just to give an overview of kind of what we'll discuss today, we'll give a very brief overview of the Global Health Supply Chain and Procurement Supply Management Project. Talk a little bit about the current landscape of UAVs and development, and more so on cargo, our activities around UAVs, how we would like to add to the knowledge base of UAVs, and then kind of delving into evaluating UAVs themselves and manufacturers. And so we're not going to be able to get into all the specifics of the guide because there's lots of specifications and questions listed, but we'll kind of touch upon sort of the higher level things you'd like to look at. And again, happy to share our specific experiences if you have questions around that. So just to go over, for those who aren't familiar, the Global Health Supply Chain Procurement and Supply Management Project, the name gives away a lot of what it's about, but it's a very large USAID project, which does a few things, so 3 main objectives. And I want to lay these out just so you can see where UAVs fit into the work we're doing. So we do a lot of procurement of commodities, of health commodities, and the logistics around those. So international shipments into countries, and we're, I think, near 60 countries or so at this point for procurement. We also provide system strengthening and technical assistance to those countries. So we're both providing in some cases, we are providing our own parallel supply chains where we're responsible for delivering commodities. And in about over 30 countries, we're providing technical assistance directly to governments, their parastatals, their central warehouses, to how to improve their supply chain operations. And objective 2 is really where the UAV work sits. And then we have global collaboration as well. And just as a map of the countries that we're working in, there's the correct number, 62 countries we're currently serving. So on the project, let me just go back a minute. On the project, we were very fortunate as that USAID had provided funding for UAV work. And so the team for UAV sits within this project and has been given funds to both research and to implement UAV activities. So that's why I think it was chosen for this project, because we are looking at last mile delivery of health commodities, and there's an interest in determining how we could utilize UAVs for that purpose. So those of you who work in UAVs probably already know, but just to cover, the UAVs in development for imaging, that's a bit of more of a mature field, right? People have been doing that for over a decade, and there's been advances in very interesting work along artificial intelligence for imaging and such. But that's what I would say in relation to cargo delivery. It's more of a mature field. And so UAVs for cargo is really in its infancy. And so that has several implications in terms of where manufacturers are, how many manufacturers there are, how much testing has been done or implementation. And there has been some implementation, but what we see is that there's not a whole lot of coordination between the donors themselves or those who are implementing projects. There's been, I mean, over the last several years, some brief pilots, so 5 days, a couple weeks or so. But what I gather from conversations with people is that they tend to think there's a lot more happening in terms of cargo delivery with UAVs than there actually is happening. And I think that's because when there's an activity, there's a lot of information that's disseminated, a lot of press around those activities. And so what I try to remind people is that we really are still learning at this point. There hasn't been very many activities. And as I said earlier, when we do have them, they tend to be very short. And so we're learning only a certain amount. And really importantly is that information is not being shared from those activities widely so others can learn. And I think if we're going to move UAVs forward and have them utilized more regularly in development and for cargo movement, I think it's important we build upon each other's work. And I think there's several reasons for the lack of sharing of information. I think we could attribute that to both a lack of coordination and a place to come together, which Paul and his group is one group trying to fix that problem. I think sometimes there's the competitive aspect of it. And I think also because the sector is in its infancy, a lot of prototypes are being used for these activities, and therefore information isn't openly shared about those UAVs themselves. And so what we really have yet to see is how sustainable and applicable UAVs are to the work, at least to our work in terms of moving health commodities. I'm sure there's other areas that are being looked at as well. And we're only going to get that by increasing utilization. And I think that all comes back to us coordinating and sharing information. So our journey, as I mentioned earlier, we had received funding. And what the interest was for us to look at, obviously, last mile delivery. This was a PEPFAR funded activity, so through USAID. So there's a focus on the transport of lab samples. And we are also looking at the movement of health commodities. And it wasn't, for us, we don't want to test the technology. We want to determine how we can integrate UAVs into a supply chain, how we can make them sustainable, where it makes the most sense to utilize the technology. And there's some differences when you're looking at doing a multi-month or year-long activity compared to 5 days. Is is important to recognize the challenges you'll have to figure out solutions for around staffing, around maintenance of the UAV. Do you lease it? Do you own it? And there's all these questions that maybe won't come up initially through a 5-day activity, say. What we're interested in measuring at this point is how we can improve health outcomes. I think there's been some activities looking at how to replace motorcycles and make it just as cost efficient. I think it's very difficult at this stage for us to do that with the cost of UAVs, but they are coming down. And so at some point, I think that's a question worth asking. And I think knowing the costs are very important, but if that's the measure of success, I think it might be difficult to be succeeding. So we're looking at really how to improve health outcomes, how to make it sustainable and something that can be handed over, hopefully, to the private sector. I know in some cases, people ask about handing it over to the government. That certainly is an option. In our work, we often look to have the government contract out their transportation or warehousing. So we think it'd be the same for the drones. If we don't want them to own trucks, we necessarily don't want them to own UAVs themselves. We're focusing in rural settings. We have visited 4 countries to have scoping visits, speak with the ministries of health, civil aviation, various stakeholders, and lay out how we would move an activity forward. And so now we're at the phase in several countries where we're seeking approval from the civil aviation to move forward with an activity. So for our work and why we're here today is that we carried out a competitive process for procuring UAVs and UAV services. And it was a very interesting challenge, because if it's something we haven't procured before and there's not a lot of information about what these UAVs can do, it takes a lot of research to figure out what kind of specifications you should be asking for and what kind of questions you should be asking. And so it's hard to compare different companies when they're not necessarily commercially available or they're just prototypes. And so those are the challenges, and it was a significant challenge, and we spent quite a bit of time, and ultimately we were successful with the procurement process. And so we thought it was important that we share that information with those who are going to undertake that process, because there's no point in everybody else starting from zero. If we've learned a lot, we want to share that with others, and then for other people who've gone through the same process, they can share that information with us, and we can continually improve our guide. And so I touched on it a little bit. I think it's important that we are adding to the knowledge base of the UAV community. We're only going to move this along faster and get adoption of the technology if we are working on this together and building on each other's success and experiences. So what we know from just conversations and what we see happening through publications is that many organizations and also governments are looking to utilize UAVs. And so there's many areas, but there's in terms of imaging or mapping, but we also see a lot in interest in cargo. And that for these organizations, they also, like us, haven't had to procure a system like this before. And so it's uncharted territory. And so for our process, whether it be for the procurement or any other step in our process, the scoping visits we undertake in country, how we interact with civil aviation, how we ultimately plan an activity and implement the activity and monitor it, we want to share sort of the knowledge we gain and experiences through guides like we've produced around procurement. So we expect this to be the first of many guides to come out. And we hope that others in the community are also sharing information that they're gaining. And this opportunity here to communicate with the community would be great for us to have further conversations after this and figure out where we can collaborate when that makes sense, and just have regular conversations about the work that we're undertaking. So evaluating UAV manufacturers, we kind of broke it down into sort of six general areas that you would likely want to consider when looking at a UAV. And first, I would recommend that you think about what you want to use the UAV for, because that will help you determine what type of technologies you're looking at. Obviously, there's different types of UAVs. You have the multi-copter and the fixed wing and the hybrid. You have electric, you have gas, or you have hybrid versions of that. And so knowing what you're wanting to do, and if you have certain interests where, like us, we knew we only wanted to use an electric UAV, then it makes your procurement more focused, and you can say you only want to receive bids from companies who meet the requirements that will get you the type of UAV you're looking for. So the platform itself, that's just the term we're using to refer to the UAV. I think there's lots of specifications you'll want to know. I mean, there's the ones that people get right off the top is how far can it go, how fast can it go, how much can it carry. And I think it's important, and as you'll see in the guide, we ask questions about payload capacity, for example, and the cargo hold. And so somebody might let you know that it can hold 1 kilo, 2 kilo, 6 kilos per se, but there's deeper questions you'll want to get into, which will impact sort of how you undertake your work. So how much space is available within the cargo unit itself? Is the cargo unit configurable? Can it be insulated? Does the cargo have to be in the same place every time, perfectly balanced, and counterweights have to be put on the UAV to keep it stable? So there's kind of deeper questions that need to be gotten into, and somebody might just give you a number, say we carry this much weight, but you'll want to dig a little deeper. And same with the distance. So they're often going to provide you the range of the UAV and the best case scenario. And so it's important to understand, what is the range when the weather isn't ideal, or the elevation is something different than what they've assumed it will be, or at different weights, what is the range that happens? So if you can carry a half a kilo, it might be a certain range, versus 1.5 kilos, the range will decrease. How does the battery life change over time, and how does that will obviously impact your range? So there's kind of lots of questions around platform that you'll want to know in terms of capabilities. And again, that's laid out really well in the specification section of the procurement guide.
We have a question really quickly online. Yeah. Why, in our case, were you only interested in looking for electric UAVs?
Okay, so the question about looking for electric UAVs, for us, it was just the logistics around supporting. If we needed fuel, it added to the complexity of what we were trying to accomplish. So certainly being able to charge batteries with electricity, you hope that a facility will have electricity. If not, you'll need to get a generator. But there was the logistics around the fuel that we were concerned about, and where we'd have to place fuel. The other issue was around the maintenance of something that wasn't all electric. I think when we start getting into motors, there's a different level of cost and complexity in terms of maintenance. So for us, electric based made the most sense. But we can see in certain situations, since we were looking at going to health facilities that are very remote, and it didn't make a lot of sense for us. But if we had going from point A to point B back and forth regularly, and it might be a different story for us. So that's why we chose electricity. So bullet number 2 on the flight system. So the flight system, it's, companies have an option to build their own system, or they can use an off-the-shelf system. So when you're planning flights, monitoring flights, what is that done on is important. And so why it's important to us was the ease of use. And so you could have a system that's designed that people can be trained on it, that isn't very complicated, and that's helpful for looking to hand over the system to somebody else. And so I think if you have a system off the shelf, it might not be as intuitive for a non-technical person. And so it's just important to understand what the flight system, the ease of use, what its capabilities are. And I would ask the question of, I'd ask many questions, but one question would be: Is this something that you have developed, or is this something that you have procured standard off the shelf? One thing that we found was the flexibility, and flexibility. What we mean here is that, is the company willing to make adjustments for your needs? Or are they telling you this is the UAV as it is, kind of take it or leave it? And I think if you have certain needs, it's important that you articulate those, and companies may not have that option available, but might be willing to work with you to make that adjustment. So for example, if you have a cargo area and they currently do not insulate it, but you would like it insulated for you, that would be something that they might be able to adjust. Can you drop cargo from altitude? Can the cargo be released on the ground and the UAV take off? These kinds of adjustments. Is there a way for a camera to be integrated so you can see when you're landing at a health facility? So there's things that might not be on the UAV, especially if it's a newer company and they've come out with a certain model. It's definitely worth asking what they're able to do to adjust for your needs. And I think that's an important consideration. And we have staff availability as another consideration. This is not, at this stage, is not a procurement. We're not just buying something off Amazon. This is really going to be a collaboration with the UAV manufacturer, most likely. And so what you're going to need is them to help in the process of both getting approval from civil aviation, to help you understand if the sites are suitable for use where you're planning on working. And ultimately you're going to need them there initially to begin flying and helping with operations. And at some point, the idea is they would hand it over. But you'll need to know how available are they to participate in your activity. You might have a timeline of operating something in the next 3 months or 6 months, and you'll want to know, are they available to come into country with you? Are they available to answer questions you might get from civil aviation, whether it be in person or in writing? How long will it take to schedule them to come into country? Do they have consultants they work with they could send in for you or for them if they can't come themselves? So these are really important things to understand. And as there's only so many companies available, their availability might be limited to come and work directly with you in countries. So definitely an important consideration. And since it is something you're partnering with an organization, and hopefully you want to stay with a company for a while, and if you're leasing a product and you want to get the latest technology, you want to kind of know how their technology has been evolving, both for your purposes now, but I think it's very interesting for the companies we spoke to was to see the iterations they have gone through for their technology. And you can see what they've learned, how many adjustments they've made, and just that they have an eye to constantly improving. And so what we've seen with some companies is that they are, at a quick rate, increasing their payload capability, their range, adding features in, safety features as such. And so there's lots of changes happening in the industry in terms of regulation, and governments are asking for certain safety features to be applied. And so knowing that the company is able to evolve very quickly, incorporate new technology, make adjustments that are required for the industry is also really important to know. Something a little bit on the softer side, we listed again as partnership. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to spend a lot of time with the manufacturers. You're going to be out in the field together. You're going to be thinking about the design of the activity most likely. And so you want to make sure that your ideas and approaches and personalities line up really well, because that's going to be part of the success of your activity is how well you're able to work together with the company. So this is something that's important, and certainly through just an RFP process, you're not going to pick up on that. That's going to happen as you do visits with manufacturers. So I'm going to get into the why manufacturer visits are critical. So one is that the technology is very much often new, right? So some companies have had their their systems tested repeatedly, either in-house or they've sold systems or done that or leased them, and they have experience running their UAVs for an extended period of time. But some of these are, brand new technologies or prototypes, and so you're going to get responses in your procurement where people are making claims, and what you really want them to be able to do is to demonstrate in person for you that the UAV itself can do exactly what they've told you it can do, both in terms of the performance, but in terms of the ease of use. And so if they tell you it can fly a certain amount of time, it can carry a certain amount of weight, you really want to have them demonstrate it. It's easy to put stuff down on paper, but it's important that you want to see it and have it proven. And I just want to check to make sure we have a question. Great. So the countries there was a question about the countries that we are looking at. The countries that we've undertaken scoping visits so far is Rwanda, Zambia, Malawi, Lesotho, and we hope to be going to Tanzania in the very near future. And then, so somebody made a point, which is a great point, about the fuel issue, is that even when you have availability to the fuel, the quality of fuel can be an issue. And so again, it goes into just the logistics around fuel and concerns that raise, or just other issues you have to address when dealing with fuel. And so at this point, we think it's hard enough to get an activity going and manage that, so the complexity of fuel is not being added to. One more question was about the possibility of a solar powered or solar battery hybrid technology. So that's a great question about utilizing solar. We talked about that from our understanding, and I'm not an engineer, but the companies we spoke with is just the consumption of the UAV in terms of the power required, that the solar panel is not able to provide that type of information. But I think for charging in some locations, to charge batteries, will require solar panels as an option. And so at this point, unfortunately, solar is not something that's available, but it would be a great solution to help with some of these issues. And there's one more, and I'm not sure why there's like a red line on the PowerPoint presentation. That's not on my end. So what about, okay, one question was, what about a UAV which can take off vertically and land at a destination? So for our work, since we wanted to be able to collect lab samples, the type of technology we were interested was a UAV that could do vertical takeoff and landing. And so the companies that we considered were only companies that could undertake that work. And so there's some that can't do that and it can only drop off product. But for our needs, we wanted to be able to land at a facility in a remote area without us being present, and that could drop off commodities as well as take lab samples back. And so once the UAV cargo area was unloaded from the cargo, the health workers could load on the lab samples and it could return back to the location. So for our purposes, and all the pictures in the presentation are of a hybrid vertical takeoff and landing UAV. So the demonstration, just to go back to that, and is that it's really important that they can demonstrate what is in their specifications and what they say they can do. From our experience, there is sometimes a difference between what is listed in the response to proposal and what can actually be achieved, or things are kind of left vague, and it really is important that you are there to understand the full capacity of something or its limitations. So the other reason you'd want to undertake a visit is for you and your team to be able to interact with the UAV itself. And so you'll want to assemble the UAV and disassemble the UAV. You'll want to do that because you want to know how easy or difficult it is to do that. You want to know how it is to manage to move the UAV once it's, either when it's unpacked or when it's unassembled and in a box, how heavy is it? How heavy is the box? How big is the box? Will it fit in the truck? And all the manufacturers should have a box that their UAV fits into when it's unassembled. So that will be something you'll be interacting with when you have your activity, and you'll want to know, what is the storage space required for the UAV when it's unassembled and assembled. And so how complicated is it? We've seen different types of UAVs that have different levels of ease in terms of assembling and disassembling them. Some are as simple as only 3 parts that come up, that make up the UAV. And the connections themselves, how are you plugging in multiple wires? Is it one wire? Do you have to plug wires in by hand, or when you assemble it, everything gets connected automatically? These are things you'll want to look at. Flight planning. When you're doing a demonstration, you're going to want to have them go out to demonstrate exactly what you're trying to do. So you want them to take off and then land at a different part of the property and then come back. But you'll want to be doing flight planning for that. So you want them to show you exactly what it takes to plan something like that, and exactly what it takes for it to come back. Yep. What it's like to load and unload the cargo area is something that you'll want to know, because again, how easy is it to get into the cargo area? Is it difficult because there's propellers in the way? Is it easy to open the cargo box? Well, if you have multiple loads in the cargo area, can you separate them? Does the cargo area, some of them might have to be perfectly balanced, so the cargo has to be in the same location always, and then depending on the weight, a counterweight might need to be put in. And so these things, as you're interacting with it, you'll understand. How much room is there for error when you're loading and unloading, if it's not closed properly, and such like that. Really recommend. Battery charging, along with loading and unloading, battery charging is something that potentially that the health facility staff or whatever staff are interacting with the UAV who aren't technical experts are going to have to do. And so the question is, how difficult is it to undertake that process? And so if you have a health facility that needs to change a battery, something can return, how easy is that process to undertake? And then again, when I was talking about sort of the personalities and relationship, during a demonstration, it's really your time to interact with the management and with the staff and to talk about things further. And you'll get a really good feeling as to, one is like how confident they are with the technology as you're asking them questions, how interested they are in collaborating in the work you do, how open they are to again, making any necessary adjustments, and just really understanding the sort of their mentality. And they will talk to you about probably their history and the different types, their different iterations of their technology. And so we would recommend highly that you do not proceed without visiting manufacturers in person. So
someone has asked if you don't mind sharing the criteria for selecting pilot countries.
The criteria for selecting pilot. So the criteria for selecting pilot countries, someone asked about. Yes, we haven't documented that, so we don't have it in like a guide per se, and so it's something we want to come out with. But at kind of the really high level, let me just say, to answer the question about selecting countries. I mean, for us, selecting countries, the first requirement is that it's has an HIV focus. This is a PEPFAR funded activity, and so if there was not any PEPFAR work being undertaken in that country, then we wouldn't be pursuing that country as an option for us. And so there's, I think ideally you'd like to find countries where there's an interest and openness to utilize UAVs. It's great to be convincing people and kind of letting them know all the potential of UAVs. But if you're starting at zero, it just takes a lot of time and work. And so we're very interested in countries who have expressed interest, who are kind of forward-looking and leaning, civil aviations that might have experience with this type of activity, ministries of health who are interested in this type of work, and that there's a good use case for it. So that's kind of a general, and that's like a whole topic that we can get into, and hopefully have another webinar on. as well as for us to put forward some documentation and guides about our work and what we find and how we plan out our scoping visits. So the last slide is really just to, I think you can get the guide through through the invitation, but it's available on our Global Health Supply Chain website. You can download it there. We aren't able to put it up yet. We're just a technical issue with the website, but I've created a Excel version of the guide because there's lots of tables with specifications, and if you want to utilize it in your procurement, instead of copying and pasting it, I thought it would be easier if we had it in an Excel sheet available for you. So you have my email, and you can write me directly. I'm happy to send you an Excel version of the guide if you would like that. So I wanted to really just take up half the time with the guide and allow the rest of the time for questions from the group. And again, I guess this one really important point is that we definitely want to hear from others who have undertaken this process. I mean, if we're focusing right now just the conversation about procurement, we want to hear from you on this, and definitely want to hear from others who are working in this space so we can share lessons learned and collaborate. And I know Paul and the UAV Payload Delivery Working Group is trying to accomplish that. But for the procurement side, we very much would like to, capture anything that, you find is missing in the guide or that could be improved. We'd like to come out with new iterations every 3 to 6 months for others to share it. And this is, just to make sure it's clear, is that you don't have to ask all these questions or have all these specifications in your procurement, your RFP. You can find what's relevant, and also this is for us, for implementers and people who are looking to procure. But for manufacturers, I think it really helps them think about how they want to put forward their specifications and what groups like ours are looking for, because sometimes our context is new to them. And so we want to make sure our needs have gotten across. So let me just stop there and see if we have any questions on that are typed, or yeah.
We have a number. First, how many manufacturers and operators have you assessed to develop the guidelines?
So the guidelines, I would say a large part of it. So I would say 4 initially. As we read about, and we're always looking to see what technology comes out, that allows us to know additional questions that we should be asking. And I would say even after we've done the procurement, as we've moved forward, there's things that we thought, oh, this would have been really good to know ahead of time. And so we didn't just publish our specifications that were in our procurement. We spent a lot of time kind of assessing lessons learned and incorporating those changes into our guide. So in lots of ways, I wish we had this guide when we started the process, because there's some good ones in there that we didn't capture on our initial effort.
All right, what have you learned about the impact of communications equipment on the reliability of the system tracking and data link? So radios or antennas.
Yeah. So for us, we're still in our planning stages for our activity. So the actual implementation, I think, is where we'll see the importance of the communication equipment. If we're talking about trying to work in very remote areas where you're going beyond visual line of sight, where you're potentially changing batteries so the UAV can kind of go its maximum distance, it's the communication capabilities and is very important, because obviously it makes your mission more successful. But for the civil aviation, this is something that they're very interested in knowing, how well you're able to communicate with the UAV from your ground station. What happens if communication is broken? What safety features are in place? And so I think there's interesting technologies that are coming out that, where you can utilize 3G networks to communicate with the UAV. But but in terms of firsthand experience, we haven't been able to delve any deeper than that in terms of what our experience is.
Hi, this is Olivier. Can I complement? Can I add to your answer, Scott?
Yeah.
And specifically on the communication capability of drones. As Scott started, this is Olivier from Village Reach. As Scott mentioned, when you go beyond visual line of sight, I mean, it is really imperative that the communication between the pilots or the central control system and the drone and the bird is on at all time, and it is part of if you look at the regulation that's being developed internationally and in countries, it is one of the guideline that is really being emphasized, is at all time and for security purposes, because before anything, security should be the priority, and that communication is at all time a certain thing, and you know, there is protocol. When you talk to manufacturers, they have protocols, they have alternative. They lose communication satellite, they go use 3G and so on. But those, I highly recommend that when you visit the manufacturer or you do some test flight, that you actually intentionally test their system of communication and what happened when it's failed. So what would happen if it start losing the communication satellite or 3G or 2G or whatever, and really test that on purpose, because when it happens on real life and you're not prepared for that, that can put everything into a bad situation.
Oh yeah, thank you, Olivier. That's a great point. I'm just looking at the questions that are typed out, and also feel free to jump in, anybody who has a question. And they're asking if the UAVs are set up to deliver temperature sensitive items. And so I think one thing to keep in mind regarding temperature sensitive items is that the flight time is often not very long for a UAV to get to a location. So if it's flying at 80 kilometers an hour, you're likely going to be reaching a facility in less than an hour. And so what we expect to do is to have insulation inside the cargo area. So that would allow us to move temperature sensitive products. So both temperature monitoring to occur inside so we can have certainty, but no need for refrigeration itself. And there's been some questions about the countries. So again, that we were looking at the 4 countries. So we're assessing those and moving along in the process with civil aviation. So we are can't give specific experiences in terms of the implementing. What I think we should hopefully do is have conversations around the process that we have undertaken for the scoping visits and how to interact with civil aviations, because that's going to be a big part of any activity and something that's kind of significant to overcome to move forward.
On that topic, Scott, just want to mention to the community that the working group will be organizing a webinar around that specific topic, I think early September, around stakeholder engagement in management and community engagement. So it can be with ministers, can be with civil aviation, community, all the community outreach and sensitization and so on. All that aspect is going to be a topic of one webinar in early September. I think Paul can mention that.
Yeah, that webinar will be on September 12th. So we'll be sending out an invite on that, but just if you want to pencil that into your calendars, that is coming up next month. Yep.
Yeah. And we have a question about warranty and insurance. I think those are really good points to raise. So it's definitely something, and that might not be something that I have to look that we captured. That we captured. Yeah. So the warranty, what warranty exists for the UAV? to understand what type of insurance that the company has. Obviously, your own company, you need to understand what insurance your insurance covers. And so we were both exploring the option to lease UAVs and to purchase the UAV itself. And so obviously in that we need staff from the manufacturer. It's part of the process that we got pricing for their time to work with us. So there's kind of looking at it in terms of a guide to procure UAVs, and it's for UAV services as well, because that will be a big component of it. And I think most likely on our end, we're going to be leasing the UAVs just for how we're structured. It makes the most sense for us. I don't have any other questions that have been typed.
Yeah, this is Paul again. I see a question previously from Matt Weber from the Ghana Global Fund. I think he had asked if there are standards for flight in inclement weather, if that's included in this guide.
Well, so I think what we have in there is in terms of the wind, like what is the maximum wind that it could fly in, is important to know, as well as during the rain, how much rain can it take? If, the engine will be problematic if it's raining, and often it could be kind of gray, where it will say it's okay, but to only a certain extent with rain, or not at all. So it's something that we're asking about, both in terms of water and wind, how that impacts it. And so not only when to what speed it can fly up, or what wind speed it can fly in, but if it's flying and it experiences wind speed above what it's supposed to be flying in, then what happens? Does it land? Does it return back? And so that would also be part of the process for when you're setting out to do a flight that day. Are you looking at the weather? How are you assessing the weather conditions? So there's the process for operations that you'll want to know from the manufacturer if they're going to be flying the UAV for you. I think that's the only other question on the website. If anybody wants to just ask a question, that also works.
Dieter Klein just sent me a private question. He said, what are the experiences so far with the UAV in the picture on the guide?
So the UAV, so the UAV in the picture on the guide is a Wingcopter 178. And so that is the company that we're contracting with. And that company, Wingcopter, has also, so one of the reasons we selected Wingcopter was because their UAV was commercially available. So it had been proven in various scenarios, both for imaging and for cargo movement. And so they have recently completed activity in Tanzania, where they were delivering cargo to an island, medical supplies and samples to an island. And so that technology has been proven there, as well as, again, for imaging in different countries. So we're excited to move forward with Wingcopter for our activities. But I'll defer you to the company offline to share with you kind of their full list of numbers around test flight, or numbers sold and activities they've undertaken.
You touched on this a bit earlier, Scott, but there is a question on whether there's been an analysis of cost comparison with the regular distribution system.
Yeah, so I think the question about cost comparison, it's very difficult and I was mentioning earlier that there's just been so little done with UAVs activities, and again, what's been published. And for a 5-day activity, you're not really getting a good sense of what the cost is. And when you're using prototypes, you're not really getting a good sense of what the cost is. And something to be aware of when utilizing prototypes is that your cost for use will be very high, because you're helping to pay for research and development. So one of our attractions to Wingcopter, as I mentioned, was it's commercially available, and we're not paying for their their research and development. And so there's been lots of scenarios done for how to modeling for what the cost would be for utilizing UAV, but this is all just assumptions at this point of what it costs. And so I think what we hope to learn and to share with the community through our activities for a multi-month project, and hopefully over a year, would be, what is the cost of operating? What does it involve to maintain and to staff? You know, and the price of UAVs is going to fluctuate depending on how many you buy. And as time goes on, they're going to get cheaper and cheaper. So we haven't been modeling out how we can make it cost effective compared to a motorcycle, because there's all sorts of issues that have yet to be really determined. And then the frequency of use is also another big part of it. So that's something we want to add to the conversation through our activity. We'll be keeping track of costing and operational constraints, but we have no conclusions to share at this point.
There's a great question here about strategies in place to prevent or deal with anyone who might try to knock the UAV out of the air.
Yes, so that is often a thing people bring up. When we were in Lesotho, people often talked about the folks who manage the cattle out in the field, the herd boys, and they're very skilled at throwing rocks. And so that was something that's been raised in several countries. And so I think it's something that we need to be concerned with. I think we, and Olivier alluded to the community kind of engagement aspect of this work. You can't just go into an area and begin flight operations without engaging the community. I think if you engage with the community and they understand what you're trying to do and understand what the UAV is being utilized for, you're more likely to get them on your side and not have people want to, damage the UAV itself. I think this is certainly an area that will be answered, or a question that will be answered as we get more experience, and not just ourselves, but others in the community. I think when you're doing a long-term project, these are things you'll be facing. And even if you do a good deal of community engagement, there's always people who are up to no good. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens. I think the altitude you fly at will impact that, as well as the areas you're flying into, if they're more heavily populated than others. So something we'll want to keep track of.
Great. Anyone else have any other questions? You can either type it or just unmute your microphone.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much, Lewin. I am Abdoulaye from Senegal, past office. I want to know what happens when the UAV meet an obstacle during its flight, like an antenna.
Sorry, so was your question about if it's an upstart company?
No, an obstacle like an antenna. An antenna or a building.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, I see. So yeah, so one thing that needs to be determined is, right, so if there's power lines or antennas, and yeah. From my understanding from the manufacturers, what they've told me is that, so some things are on maps and they can account for those when they are doing their flight planning. And some things might not be on the map that are put up for construction purposes or new power lines. And so I think the technology to kind of sense and avoid is starting to be integrated, but not something that's regularly integrated. And so what we expect, and I think it depends on the project, but most civil aviations will want you to be having set routes, flight plans for the areas you're serving. And so when you're planning those routes is when you will need to be taking into consideration what might be in the way. And again, it's not a static situation. So there needs to be better technology to be able to recognize when there's something that's in the flight path of the UAV. But that's something that we are planning to put in mitigate that as much as possible. But I think the technology is really what's going to help with that. But that's more on the manufacturers, who could probably give you like the latest and greatest as to what is going to be incorporated. But it's certainly a question that you'll want to ask manufacturers as to what technology they have integrated into their UAV to to help with that, and what planning they do, and for terms of flight plans to mitigate that risk.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Anyone else have any other questions? I guess we could take one more before we close this webinar.
If there is no more question, this is Olivier from Village. I just want to add a comment around the cost efficiency. You know, it's really important to think at the system level, and that looking at deploying, implementing a UAV is more than just using a bird to deliver one type of commodities. If you think about scaling it up and making this innovation sustainable, and more the discussion that we're having with in-country partner and stakeholder in the private sector is to really integrate the use of UAV into a existing transport system, and not just for one type of commodity, vaccine or family planning or laboratory sample. It's really like looking at the best business model and how the implementation of a system like UAVs into a country can be done in a sustainable way, and maybe across services, across sector, and in order to make it sustainable and cost efficient. So right now, as Scott said, the UAV for payload delivery is really in the infantry. So we're still learning a lot from the technical point of view, from how it would work, feasibility, and how it would look like into the country. But then, you know, once this is better understood, we can start thinking about, well, we should start right now, but thinking about how to make it sustainable. And that probably the key would be to look around across services and across sector in a country setting to make it cost efficient. And just wanted to add this.
Yeah, and for us, we see it as a tool to use, and certainly making it cost effective will improve the usability and application of it. I think in some cases, if there's some areas that are very hard to reach and otherwise don't have the solution, it makes it possible to make deliveries which otherwise wouldn't be made, or in a time frame that wouldn't otherwise be achieved. And so similarly, in some countries, you know, here we have, if you're in a car accident and they'll send a helicopter, if there's the quickest way to get you back, it's certainly not cost effective, but it saves lives. And so I think there's several ways to look at it. And I think it's important for us to make the case both for how it can become cost effective and utilize in that manner, and where it can really improve health outcomes in something that is really the only option for delivering service.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. This was a great presentation, also a lot of engagement. Everyone, thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or have any further information you'd like to share with Scott on his guide, his email is here shared. And also, if you are not part of the working group, feel free to email me as well, and we can get you signed up for all of our mailings and events. I will also be sharing a recording of this webinar along with the procurement guide. So that'll be coming out soon as well. So thank you all for joining. Have a great day or evening. Thanks.